Welcome to the first service at Morgan Mill Baptist Church today. Our key verse today is Ephesians chapter 3 in verse 20. In our series of Where in the Bible, last week we were in Ephesus, and this week we are yet again in Ephesus. Last week we were looking at the book of Revelation, referring to the church at Ephesus. This week we're looking at the epistle written to the church at Ephesus. This is a much earlier time than the passage we were looking at last week in the book of Revelation. Probably the book of Ephesians was written around 60-61 AD. The book of Revelation was probably written 94 to 96 AD. The text doesn't tell us exactly what years. We have to use both the context and the surrounding information that we have. Around 35 years before this epistle was written to the church at Ephesus, 35 years before the warnings that we looked at last week from the book of Revelation. There are some who argue that the book of Revelation was written in Nero's reign, which would have put it in the 60s. But the seven churches warned in the book of Revelation that we looked at last week were much different churches in the 60s. We know because of the context of the epistles that are written in God's Word. The failure of these churches was from one generation of a church to a future generation of a church. So today, approximately 35 years earlier than the passage that referred to the church at Ephesus last week, in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. Power is a word that we remember at this point in time, after all the snow and ice storms in Texas and all the damage that caused the power failures of different sorts. There were many different power sources during that storm, and various ones failed to different degrees. This is not a criticism or advocacy, it's just a timely sermon illustration. The ice and cold caused some wind generators to fail, some natural gas plants to fail. Solar options were compromised with snow, ice, clouds, and night. To my knowledge, 5 heat sources were uncompromised: firewood, hydroelectric, the more stable fossil fuels, and 2 nuclear sources. The nuclear power plants, one very near us, those nuclear power plants are indoors, so they're not affected by the weather outside. They were not compromised. The other, which many do not think of as a nuclear power source, is God's nuclear reactor, the sun. God's nuclear reactor did not fail. The sun is nuclear energy. God, in his creation, though, had the ability to put his nuclear reactor 93 million miles away from Earth. With that context of power, and we've been reminded of the need for power and light and heat and all the things that accompany power, let's look again at verse 20. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. The Greek text there for power is dunamis. We get our English words from the same Greek root of dynamo and dynamite. In the context of the Bible, this is the supernatural power of God associated with creation originally and the supernatural miracles of God since his creation, thus fitting the definition of supernatural. Now, as we look more at both Ephesians, the 3rd chapter, those 35 years prior to the passage we looked at last week in the book of Revelation, referring to the church at Ephesus, we will be reminded of why Christians need to rely upon the power of God in their lives, not just from a generation to a generation, but on a daily basis. And we'll see why Christians need to rely upon the supernatural power of God in part 2 of today's Bible study, and that will be next.